The void had never seemed so hungry. Horus stood upon the command deck of the vengeful spirit, watching as Davin's moon filled the viewport like a rotting eye. The satellite turned in its perpetual dance, silver gray and scarred, its surface etched with the architecture of civilizations that had risen and fallen before mankind ever reached for the stars. Something about it pulled at the edges of his awareness. A whisper, just beyond hearing. A scent of copper and ash that had no place in the recycled air of his flagship. The Warmaster did not speak. Around him, the bridge crew moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had conquered 100 worlds, their devotion to him absolute, their faith in his vision unshakable. They had followed him from Terra to the galaxy's edge, had watched him illuminate the darkness with the Emperor's light, had seen him raise the Aquila over worlds too numerous to count. Yet now, in this moment, suspended between the known and the unknowable, even the most hardened veterans felt something cold settle in their bones. "My lord," came the voice of Malachurst, the Twisted, his equerry. The man's hunched form approached from the shadows, his movements careful, despite the augmetics that kept him mobile. "The lodges report readiness. The Mournival awaits your word." Horus turned from the viewport, and in that movement was all the terrible beauty of the Imperium's greatest son. He stood taller than any man had right to stand, his armor the white of newborn stars, his face carved from the same divine template that had given the Emperor his warriors. Yet something flickered behind those eyes, something that had not been there before the diplomatic mission to Davin, before the warrior lodges had grown like hidden cancers throughout his legion. Before the whispers had begun. "Send word to Abaddon," Horus said, his voice carrying the weight of authority absolute. "We descend at dawn. The moon holds answers I require." The compliance of Davin had been swift, surgical, a demonstration of the Luna Wolves' tactical supremacy. The world's governors had bent their knees, had welcomed the imperial truth with open arms and treaties signed in gold. It should have been a triumph, another jewel in the crown of the Great Crusade. Yet the moon, the forsaken satellite that circled Davin like a carrion bird, had been deemed a matter requiring the Warmaster's personal attention. Intelligence spoke of temples abandoned, of the native population fled to the lunar surface, of some religious fervor that had driven them to isolation rather than compliance. The Mournival had counseled caution. Little Horus Axamund, Tarek Torgadin, Garviel Loken, and above all, Ezekiel Abaddon, they had stood before their Gene Father and voiced their concerns. The moon felt wrong, they said. The auguries returned fractured readings. The remembrancers whispered of nightmares among the fleet. But Horus was the Warmaster, chosen by the Emperor himself. And when he decided that a matter required his attention, no force in the galaxy could turn him from his purpose. Now, as the fleet made its final preparations, as the drop pods were loaded and the Stormbirds prepared for launch, a different kind of preparation took place in the shadows. The warrior lodges met in secret chambers, their rituals hidden from the light of the Imperium, their oaths spoken to brotherhood rather than to the distant throne of Terra. They told themselves it was merely fraternity, merely the bonds between warriors who had bled together. But the lodges had grown beyond simple brotherhood. They had become something else, something that festered in the gaps between loyalty and ambition, between faith and doubt. Erebus moved among them like a shadow, given purpose. The first chaplain of the Word-bearers had come to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet with words of unity and cooperation between legions, and Horus had welcomed him. Why should he not? The Great Crusade was a joint endeavor, and the Word-bearers had proven themselves loyal despite the shame of monarchia. Erebus spoke with eloquence of the Emperor's vision, of the Warmaster's destiny, of the glory that awaited those who had the courage to seize it. And when he spoke, men listened. Even Astartes, even the sons of Horus himself, found their certainties wavering under the chaplain's careful ministrations. The lodges grew. The doubts multiplied. And on Davin's moon, something ancient stirred in anticipation. The descent was fire and fury, the stormbirds screaming through atmosphere thick with ash and chemicals that burned the eyes and throat. Horus stood at the forefront of the primary lander, his armor sealed, his weapons prepared. Around him stood the Mournival, the inner circle, the chosen sons. Abaddon's face was set in its usual expression of controlled aggression, his Terminator plate a mobile fortress. Torgadon made quiet jokes that no one quite heard over the roar of engines. Aximand checked and rechecked his weapons with methodical precision. And Loken, youngest of the four, watched his gene-father with eyes that held the first seeds of doubt. They had been briefed on what to expect. Abandoned temples, empty structures, perhaps scattered resistance from the native population who had fled imperial compliance. The moon's surface was a maze of ancient ruins, layer upon layer of civilizations built atop one another. A vertical history of rise and collapse. Intelligence suggested that the governors who had led the exodus from Davin had fortified themselves in the deep temples, that they clung to their old ways with the desperation of the doomed. Intelligence was wrong. The Stormbird's ramp dropped, and they emerged into hell. The moon's surface writhed with life, but it was life twisted beyond recognition, shaped by powers that had no place in the Emperor's Imperium. The governors of Davin had not fled to hide. They had fled to transform. The temples were not abandoned. They were active, pulsing with energies that made the air itself scream. And the natives were not cowering in fear. They were waiting, changed, warped into forms that married flesh and nightmare, in combinations that offended reason. The Luna Wolves had faced many enemies in their conquests. They had broken the back of orc empires, had purged the lair from their pleasure worlds, had stood against odds that would have shattered lesser warriors. But this was different. This was not an enemy that could be outmaneuvered or outfought. This was corruption given form, madness made manifest. Faith. They came in waves, creatures that had once been human, but were human no longer. Their bodies were canvases for change, sprouting limbs and eyes and mouths in patterns that followed no biological logic. They moved with impossible coordination, their voices raised in hymns to gods whose names could not be spoken without inviting madness. And at their head came warriors in armor that mockingly mirrored the Astartes pattern, but wrong, tainted, bearing marks that made the eye slide away in revulsion. The Luna Wolves met them with bolter fire and blade, with the controlled fury that had won them 1,000 victories. The battle joined across the temple approaches, among the ruins of civilizations dead before mankind had discovered fire. Explosions lit the ash-choked sky. War cries echoed across channels that should have carried only orders. And through it all, Horus pressed forward, his sword blazing with power, his presence a beacon around which his sons rallied. Erebus was there, at the Warmaster's side, offering counsel, pointing out weaknesses in the enemy formations. The chaplain's Crozius Arcanum rose and fell, its power field crackling as it crushed skulls and shattered bones. He spoke words of encouragement, reminded the warriors of their purpose, guided them ever deeper into the temple complex. And if his guidance seemed to lead them away from their support elements, if the path he chose drew the Warmaster ever further from his legion, who would question the word of a chaplain in the heat of battle? The temple interior was a cathedral to madness, its walls carved with histories that contradicted themselves, its spaces defying geometry as they twisted through dimensions that should not exist. Horus and his honor guard pushed through chambers filled with the remnants of rituals best left undescribed, past altars stained with substances that might once have been blood but had become something else. The Mournival stayed close, their weapons never silent, their vigilance absolute. They had seen much in their years of crusading, but this place tested the limits of what even transhuman warriors could endure without flinching. Then they found the heart of it, a chamber vast enough to swallow a titan, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lack it. At its center stood a figure that radiated authority and corruption in equal measure. Yugen Temba had been the planetary governor of Davin, had been one of the first to accept imperial compliance, had been counted among the Great Crusade's success stories. But the being that wore Temba's shape now was something far removed from human governance. His body had swollen to twice its natural size, his flesh bubbling with tumors that split to reveal eyes and mouths that whispered secrets. His arms had multiplied, each bearing a weapon or artifact of power, and from his back erupted wings, not the feathered pinions of angels, but membranous structures that dripped with fluids that burned where they fell. He stood atop a dais of bones, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made reality shiver. "Warmaster," Temba said, and in that word was mockery and invitation combined. "You have come at last. We have been waiting. The gods have been waiting." Horus did not hesitate. He was the Emperor's chosen, the first among equals, and no corruption would turn him from his purpose. He charged, his sword blazing with righteous fury, his war cry echoing from the chamber walls. A Mournival followed, their weapons seeking the weak points in the monster's form. Around them, more of the twisted defenders emerged from the shadows, engaging the honor guard, separating the Warmaster from his sons. The battle was brief and terrible. Temba moved with speed that his bulk should not have allowed, his multiple limbs striking from impossible angles. His weapons carried more than physical harm. They bore the touch of powers that existed beyond the material, that reached into the soul and twisted what they found there. Horus met each attack with skill born of 2 centuries of warfare. His blade carving away corrupted flesh, his will an adamantine barrier against the psychic assault. But even the greatest can falter. Even the most skilled can make one error. And in battles where the enemy fights with more than steel and flesh. A single moment of weakness can cost everything. The blade struck from behind, wielded by Tembo with a limb that had been hidden until the perfect moment. It was not large, not compared to the massive swords the Warmaster wielded. But it was old, older than the Imperium, older than human space travel, perhaps older than humanity itself. It was a weapon of the Kinnebrock, the Xenos species the Interrex had warned against, and Erebus had placed it in Temba's hands with careful precision. The blade pierced the joint between armor plates, found the gap that should not have existed, penetrated flesh that had been engineered to resist almost any harm. Horus felt the metal enter his body, felt the sudden shock of pain that no amount of transhuman conditioning could fully suppress. And with the pain came something else, a burning that spread from the wound, like fire through dry wood, a poison not of the body, but of something deeper. He staggered. The Warmaster, who had never fallen, who had led the armies of the Imperium from the front for 200 years, took a step backward. His vision blurred. The sounds of battle became distant, hollow, and in the gap between one heartbeat and the next, he felt something reach into him, felt claws of madness scrape across the surface of his soul. No! Abaddon's roar cut through the chaos. The first captain crashed into Temba like a battering ram, his Terminator plate absorbing blows that would have killed any other warrior. The rest of the Mornaval converged, their attacks coordinated, desperate. They cut away limbs, shattered bone, burned corrupted flesh, and finally, after an eternity compressed into seconds, Temba fell, his multiple voices raised in what might have been laughter or agony or both. But their victory was ash in their mouths. Horus had collapsed, his breathing shallow, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that no Astartes should ever display. The wound in his side wept black fluid that hissed against the deck plates. And worst of all, the Warmaster did not wake. His eyes remained closed. His consciousness fled to some place beyond the reach of his son's desperate calls. "We must move," Loken said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Back to the ships, now." The withdrawal was fighting every step of the way, through corridors that seemed to shift and change, past enemies that materialized from the shadows, only to dissolve like smoke when struck. The Luna Wolves formed a cordon around their fallen Gene-Father, their bolters never silent, their determination absolute. Nothing would stop them from bringing the Warmaster home. Nothing would stand between them and their purpose. But as they fought their way back to the surface, as they loaded Horus into the Stormbird with hands that trembled despite all their training, none of them noticed Erebus hanging back, his expression carefully neutral. None of them saw the satisfaction in his eyes as the blade's work began in earnest. None of them understood that the wound was not the goal. It was merely the doorway, the crack in the armor through which powers far older than the Imperium could reach. The return to the vengeful spirit was marked by silence that felt like mourning. The Warmaster lay in the Apothecarian, surrounded by the best medical technology the Imperium could provide, monitored by sensors that tracked every function of his transhuman physiology. The chief apothecary worked with desperate precision, employing every technique in his considerable arsenal. But nothing helped. The fever climbed. The wound festered despite all attempts to cleanse it, and Horus slipped deeper into unconsciousness, his body racked by tremors, his lips moving in words that no one could understand. Word spread through the fleet like wildfire. The Warmaster was fallen. The Emperor's chosen lay dying. And with that knowledge came a fear that even Astartes, even the transhuman sons of the Primarchs, could not fully suppress. The Great Crusade had known setbacks, had suffered losses, but this was different. This struck at the heart of everything they had built, everything they believed. If Horus could fall, what did that say about the Imperium's invincibility? If even the greatest among them could be struck down, what hope did any of them have? The lodges met in emergency sessions, their members gathering in hidden chambers to share their fears and their anger. How had this happened? Why had the Warmaster been allowed to place himself in such danger? Who had failed in their duty to protect him? The questions multiplied, each one a seed of doubt that took root in fertile soil. And when Erebus spoke to them, when he offered alternative explanations, when he suggested that perhaps the Emperor's distant throne did not care as much for his sons as they had been led to believe, there were those who listened. Days passed. The fever did not break. The chief apothecary admitted what every warrior already knew but feared to voice. His skills were insufficient. The wound was beyond his ability to heal, tainted by forces he could not comprehend or combat. Death approached the Warmaster with inexorable certainty, and all the technology of the Imperium could not turn it aside. It was then that other voices began to be heard. Voices that spoke of ancient remedies, of powers that existed beyond the Emperor's truth, of ways to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The lodges debated in hushed tones. The Mournival argued with increasing desperation. And in the end, with their options exhausted and their father dying, they made a choice that would echo across the centuries. They took Horus from the Apothecarian. They bore him back to Davin's moon, to a temple that the Remembrancers had called the Delphos, a structure that predated human presence on the world by millennia. Erebus guided them, his words soothing, his presence reassuring. He spoke of the local traditions, of healing rituals that had saved countless lives, of wisdom that the Emperor's truth had too hastily dismissed. And in their desperation, in their fear, in their love for their Gene Father, they believed him. The ritual chamber was smaller than the grand hall where Temba had fallen, more intimate, lined with murals that depicted scenes of death and rebirth in cycles that spiraled through time. At its center stood a pool of liquid that was not quite water, that reflected images from angles that should not exist. Erebus directed them to lay the Warmaster beside it, to arrange his limbs in specific patterns, to speak words in languages that none of them recognized, but that resonated with something deep in their transhuman bones. The ceremony began with prayers that started innocent, but grew darker with each iteration. Incense filled the air, not the sanctified smokes of the Mechanicum, but substances that made the mind wander and the soul receptive. Around the chamber, figures emerged from the shadows, lodge members, word-bearers, and others whose allegiances were less clear. They formed a circle, their voices joining in harmonics, that made the stones beneath their feet vibrate. And in the pool, something stirred. Loken watched from the periphery, his hands clenched into fists, his instincts screaming warnings that his desperate hope forced him to ignore. This was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. The words they spoke carried weight beyond mere sound. The symbols etched into the floor pulsed with light that had no source, and the pool had begun to glow with luminescence that hurt to look upon, that revealed depths that could not exist in a container, barely a meter across. We call upon the powers that existed before the Emperor's light, Erebus intoned, his voice carrying authority that came from sources other than his chaplain's rank. We call upon those who can do what the throne cannot. We offer supplication and sacrifice in exchange for a life preserved. The pool erupted. Light and darkness swirled in combination that should have canceled each other, but instead created something new. Something that was neither and both. Tendrils of energy reached out, caressed the Warmaster's fallen form, penetrated the wounds that had refused to heal. Horus convulsed, his back arching, his mouth opening in a scream that started as pain, but transformed into something else. Something that might have been revelation, or damnation, or both. Images flooded the chamber, visions that bypassed the eyes and struck directly into the minds of those present. They saw the Emperor not as the beloved father they had believed in, but as a tyrant who used his sons and discarded them when convenient. They saw the truth of the Imperium, stripped of its propaganda, the billions crushed beneath its advance, the cultures extinguished in the name of unity. They saw themselves as tools, weapons to be wielded and eventually discarded when the Great Crusade concluded, and humanity had no more need for warriors. And they saw an alternative. They saw powers that offered strength without subservience, that valued warriors for their own worth rather than their utility. They saw the Primarchs not as servants, but as equals, not as tools, but as masters. They saw a galaxy remade not in the Emperor's image, but in their own, shaped by their will, conquered by their strength. The vision shattered. Reality reasserted itself with jarring abruptness. And in the sudden silence, broken only by harsh breathing and the drip of the pool's fluid against stone, Horus stirred. His eyes opened, not the warm brown of the beloved Warmaster, but something colder, harder, shot through with light that came from within rather than without. He rose, his movements fluid despite the wound that should have left him crippled. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the stones tremble. "I have seen," he said, each word weighted with terrible certainty. "I have seen the truth." The Mournival rushed to him, their relief palpable, their joy unrestrained. Their father lived. Their gene-sire had been returned to them. In that moment, nothing else mattered. They did not notice the shadows that clung to Horus despite the chamber's light. They did not see the way Erebus smiled in the background, his purpose accomplished. They did not understand that what stood before them wore their father's face, but held something else within. The return to the vengeful spirit was marked by celebration that swept through the fleet like a tidal wave. The Warmaster lived. The crisis had passed. The Great Crusade would continue. Marines who had maintained stone-faced discipline throughout the ordeal allowed themselves to smile. Remembrancers composed odes to resilience and brotherhood. The ships prepared to depart Davin's moon, to leave behind the world that had nearly claimed their greatest leader. But in the shadows, changes had begun that would reshape the galaxy. The lodges that had been merely informal fraternities transformed into something with darker purpose. Warriors began to question what they had never questioned before, to doubt what they had held as absolute truth. And throughout the fleet, in whispers too quiet for official channels to detect, new words began to be spoken. Words of power, words of allegiance to entities that existed beyond the Imperium's accepted reality. Horus himself seemed unchanged to casual observation. He walked among his sons with the same confidence, spoke with the same authority, made decisions with the same tactical brilliance. But those close to him, those who had known him longest, began to notice differences. His humor had grown sharper, edged with cruelty that had not been there before. His patience with Terra's dictates wore thin, and sometimes, when he thought himself unobserved, his expression shifted into something that bore no resemblance to the beloved Warmaster they had followed across the stars. The moon fell behind them as the fleet entered the warp, its engines carrying them toward new conquests, new worlds to bring into compliance. None aboard looked back at the gray sphere that rotated silently in their wake. None wanted to remember what had happened in its ancient temples. They told themselves it had been a close call, nothing more, a reminder that even the greatest must remain vigilant. But Davin's moon remembered. The temples remained, their purposes served, their rituals complete. The pool in the Delphos returned to quiescence, its depths holding secrets that would not be spoken for years to come. And on the winds that scoured the lunar surface, if one listened carefully, one might have heard laughter. Not human laughter, but something older, something that took joy in corruption sown and innocence lost. The Great Crusade continued. The Luna Wolves sailed on to new victories, their faith in their Warmaster absolute, their loyalty beyond question. They did not know that they had already lost him, that what returned from Davin's moon was not the sun the Emperor had made, but something that would unmake all that the Emperor had built. They could not see that the wound Temba had struck went deeper than flesh, that it had opened a doorway through which powers beyond mortal comprehension had reached to claim their prize. And so they celebrated their Warmaster's recovery, raised toasts to his health and strength, swore oaths of eternal loyalty to the man they believed they served. In their joy and relief, they could not hear the distant thunder of a future already set in motion, could not see the fires that would consume the galaxy, could not understand that on an unremarkable moon orbiting an unremarkable world, the Heresy had begun. The Emperor's light, they believed, would endure forever. They believed the Great Crusade was eternal, that the Imperium would spread across the stars until no darkness remained. They believed in their Father, in their purpose, in the righteousness of their cause. But belief, no matter how fervent, cannot change what was set in motion when Horus fell upon that moon, cannot undo the choice made in desperation. cannot close a door once open to powers that do not forgive and never forget. The fleet sailed on through the warp, carrying within it the seeds of destruction, and in the deepest chambers of the vengeful spirit, in a sanctum where none but the Warmaster himself could enter, Horus sat alone in the darkness, his eyes reflecting light that came from no external source, his thoughts turning to matters that would have horrified his sons had they known. Above him, the Imperium continued its expansion, confident in its destiny. Below him, in the hidden places between stars, ancient things stirred at last, their patience rewarded, their long wait ended. And across the gulf of space, on distant Terra, the Emperor sat upon his golden throne, unaware that his favorite son had been stolen from him, that the greatest victory of his enemies had been achieved, not through force of arms, but through a single poisoned blade on a moon whose name would be forgotten by history. Yet in the end, would it matter if history remembered? The wound had been struck, the corruption had taken root, and from that moment forward, nothing would ever be as it had been. The galaxy would burn, the Imperium would shatter, and brothers would turn against brothers in a war that would echo across 10,000 years. All from a blade wielded on a forgotten moon by a governor transformed into monstrosity, guided by a chaplain whose true masters dwelt in the darkness between thoughts. The planet Murder, they would call it in whispered legends, not for the world itself, but for what died there in truth. Not the Warmaster's body, which was healed, not his sons who escaped with their lives, but something more fundamental, more precious, more impossible to restore once lost. The dream of unity died on Davin's moon. The hope of enlightenment fell with Horus in that temple, and the future, the glorious future that should have been, was murdered as surely as if hands had wrapped around its throat and squeezed until the light went out. And in the silence that followed, only shadows endured, patient, hungry, and victorious at last. The weeks that followed carried the fleet through the warp's tumultuous channels, through passages between reality, where time moved differently and distance held no meaning. The navigators steered their course with practiced precision, their third eyes penetrating the Immaterium's chaos to find the paths that would carry them toward their next objective. But even they, who spent their lives gazing into the warp's depths, began to notice changes. The currents ran differently now, as if something massive had shifted in the fundamental structure of the Immaterium itself. Eddies and whirlpools appeared where none had existed before, forming patterns that might have been coincidence or might have been something far more deliberate. In the fleet's training halls, the Luna Wolves continued their martial disciplines with the same dedication that had made them legendary. They practiced blade work and bolter drills, ran tactical simulations and strategic exercises. But the nature of their training had begun to shift in ways too subtle for most to notice. Where once they had fought to bring compliance, now they fought to dominate. Where once they had studied the Emperor's treatises on the imperial truth, now they debated philosophy that questioned the very foundations upon which the Imperium had been built. The lodges had become the true centers of learning, surpassing even the formal hierarchy in their influence over the legion's collective mind. Erebus moved among them like a teacher among devoted students, never pushing, never demanding, simply offering questions that led inexorably toward conclusions that served purposes beyond the Imperium's interests. Why, he would ask, did the Emperor return to Terra while his sons continued the crusade? What was so important on that distant throne world that it required the master of mankind's full attention? And if the Great Crusade was truly the pinnacle of human achievement, why were the Primarchs not given greater autonomy in its execution? The questions were innocent enough on their surface, but they planted seeds that grew in darkness, roots that reached deep into the warriors' transhuman psyches. The Mournival found themselves divided in ways they had never experienced before. Abaddon grew more aggressive, his patience with Terra's bureaucratic delays wearing thin with each passing day. He spoke openly of the Legion's right to make its own decisions, to follow its own path without constant reference to distant authorities who could not possibly understand the realities of the Crusade's front lines. Aximand, ever the diplomat, tried to maintain balance, but even his measured words began to carry hints of frustration with the Imperium's rigid structures. Torgadon made fewer jokes, his humor darkening into something that cut rather than united. And Loken watched it all with growing unease that he could not fully articulate even to himself. Something had changed on Davin's moon, something beyond the Warmaster's physical recovery. The Legion felt different, as if a note in a great symphony had shifted slightly off-key. Individually, none of the changes were alarming. Collectively, they formed a pattern that troubled him in ways his transhuman mind struggled to process. He tried to voice his concerns to his brothers in the Mournival, but they dismissed his worries as aftershocks of the trauma they had all experienced. The Warmaster lived. That was all that mattered. But Horus himself had become something both more and less than what he had been. In council, his strategic brilliance remained undiminished. Indeed, it seemed to have grown sharper, his insights cutting through tactical problems that would have stymied lesser commanders. Yet there was a coldness to his decisions now, a willingness to expend lives that the old Horus would have preserved, to employ methods that the beloved Warmaster would have rejected as beneath the dignity of the Great Crusade. When his captains questioned these new approaches, he would fix them with a gaze that carried weight beyond mere authority, and their objections would wither unspoken. The Remembrancers, those artists and chroniclers who had been embedded within the Crusade fleets to document humanity's triumph, found their access increasingly restricted. Their requests for audiences were denied, their questions deflected, their movements confined to specific areas of the ships. Those who persisted in seeking answers found themselves reassigned to other fleets, sent away with official commendations and unofficial warnings to remain silent about what they had witnessed. The official narrative spoke only of the Warmaster's miraculous recovery, of his renewed dedication to the Great Crusade's success. The shadows that had clung to the truth were carefully excised from the record. In the deepest holds of the vengeful spirit, in chambers that had once held nothing more sinister than spare ammunition and repair equipment, new activities began to take place. Rituals were conducted behind sealed doors, ceremonies that bore no resemblance to the imperial truth's rationalist philosophy. Warriors gathered in robes rather than armor, spoke words in languages that predated human civilization, made offerings to entities whose names could not be spoken in the light. They told themselves it was merely another form of brotherhood, another way to strengthen the bonds between battle brothers. But the oaths they swore went beyond loyalty to the Legion, or even to the Warmaster. They swore allegiance to powers that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the darkness behind closed eyes, in the whispers that came in dreams. The first deaths went unremarked. A serf who stumbled into the wrong corridor at the wrong time, found days later with his mind shattered beyond the capability of the Medicae staff to repair. A junior officer who voiced concerns about unauthorized gatherings, reassigned to a hazardous duty from which he did not return. An apothecary who noted irregularities in the gene seed tithe records, discovered hanging in his quarters in what was ruled a suicide, despite the evidence that suggested otherwise. Individually, they were tragedies, accidents, the unfortunate but inevitable casualties of life aboard warships traveling through the warp's dangerous currents. Collectively, they formed a pattern of silencing, of eliminating those who saw too much or questioned too loudly. The fleet emerged from the warp at the edge of a system that had been marked for compliance. Its worlds rich in resources that would feed the Imperium's endless expansion. The local population had been contacted months before, had been given the standard choice: join willingly or be brought into compliance by force. They had requested additional time to consider, a delay that would normally have been granted with patience and understanding. But the Warmaster, who issued orders, now had no patience for hesitation, no understanding for those who did not immediately recognize the Imperium's superiority. The assault was swift and brutal, executed with a precision that spoke to the Luna Wolves' tactical mastery, but tempered by a cruelty that had no place in a war of compliance. Cities were not merely conquered, but razed. Their populations not merely subdued, but broken. Those who surrendered were treated with contempt rather than the magnanimity that had characterized the Great Crusade's early years. And when the world's leaders finally bent their knees, their acceptance came too late to spare them the consequences of their initial hesitation. Loken walked through the ashes of a city that had held 3 million souls before the bombardment began. The structures still smoldered, their ruins radiating heat that even his armor systems struggled to compensate for. Bodies lay where they had fallen, civilians who had never raised weapons against the Imperium, who had committed no crime beyond living in a city whose leaders had requested more time to consider compliance. This was not the Great Crusade he had joined, not the enlightenment the Emperor had promised to bring to the galaxy. This was something else, something that felt more like conquest for its own sake than liberation. He found Torgadon standing amid the rubble, his friend's armor scored by weapons fire, his expression unreadable behind his helm's faceplate. For a long moment, neither spoke, simply stood together in the ruins of what might have been avoided with patience and diplomacy. This is not right," Loken finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, even through the Vox. Torgadin did not respond immediately. When he did, his words carried a wariness that transcended mere physical exhaustion. "Right is what the Warmaster decides. We are his sons. We follow." "But do not finish that sentence, Garviel." Torgadin turned to face him, and even through the armor, Loken could sense his friend's tension. "Do not speak words that cannot be unspoken. The Warmaster lives. The Great Crusade continues. That is all that matters." But it was not all that mattered, and both of them knew it. Though only Loken had the courage to acknowledge the truth, even within his own thoughts. Something had died on Davin's moon, and what had risen in its place wore familiar faces, but served unfamiliar masters. The wound that blade had struck had never truly healed. It had merely scabbed over, hiding the infection that spread beneath. Above them, the vengeful spirit hung in orbit like a white blade against the stars, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Within its halls, the Warmaster planned his next conquest, his next demonstration of the power that had been gifted to him in that temple on the moon. And around him, his sons prepared to follow wherever he led, their faith in him absolute, even as the foundation of that faith crumbled beneath their feet. The planet Murder had claimed its victims, though none of them yet understood the true scope of what had been lost. The body count was still rising, would continue to rise for years to come, across worlds and systems and entire sectors of space. And by the time the Imperium realized what had been set in motion on that forgotten moon, by the time the Emperor understood that his favorite son had been stolen from him by powers he had fought contained, it would be far too late to prevent the catastrophe that approached. For now, the fleet gathered its forces and prepared to move on, to bring more worlds into compliance, to continue the work that had consumed them for 2 centuries. They believed they served the Emperor still, believed their purpose remained unchanged, and in that belief, in that willful blindness to the transformation occurring within their ranks, lay the final tragedy of Davin's moon. Not that corruption had entered their ranks, but that they could not see it, even as it consumed them from within.